"You'll never be enough." Those were the exact words my mother said as she sliced into her meatloaf, not even bothering to look up from her plate, like she was commenting on the weather, not crushing her daughter's dreams into dust. The announcement I just made about getting into Stanford's MBA program apparently warranted the same emotional investment as discussing grocery lists. My father nodded in agreement, cutting his green beans with surgical precision. "Jordan's always been a dreamer," he said to my older brother Tyler, as if I wasn't sitting right there. "Someone needs to bring her back down to earth before she embarrasses herself." Tyler smirked into his mashed potatoes, while my younger sister Emma just stared at her phone, pretending this wasn't happening. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. But it was happening. In our beige dining room in Highlands Ranch, surrounded by family photos where I was always slightly out of frame, my own blood relatives were systematically dismantling the biggest achievement of my life. And the worst part, this wasn't even close to the first time. My name is Jordan Mitchell, and that dinner happened 3 months ago. What my family didn't know that night was that their dismissal would become the fuel for a transformation so complete, so undeniable, that they'd spend the rest of their lives trying to convince people they always believed in me. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let me take you back to the beginning, because the story of how I became more than they could ever imagine starts with understanding exactly how small they always tried to make me feel. Growing up in the Mitchell household meant learning your place early and staying there quietly. Tyler was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong. Star quarterback in high school, business degree from CU Boulder, now working for a respectable insurance company and married to his college sweetheart. He was everything my parents wanted in a son, and they never let anyone forget it. Emma was the baby, the artistic one who needed protection from the harsh world. Her struggles with anxiety meant she got endless patience and support, therapy sessions my parents drove her to without complaint, and a college fund they'd protected even when money got tight. Then there was me, the middle child who somehow became invisible while being expected to excel. I was the one who made honor roll every semester but never got the celebration dinner, the one who worked 2 jobs through community college to pay my own way, while Tyler got his tuition handed to him and Emma got her art supplies funded without question. When I transferred to UC Denver and graduated summa cum laude, my parents attended the ceremony but left early because Tyler had a softball game they didn't want to miss. I told myself it didn't matter. I was building something they couldn't see yet, something that would eventually speak louder than their silence. After graduation, I landed a marketing coordinator position at a growing tech startup downtown. Nothing glamorous, but I threw myself into it with everything I had. While my coworkers were content to do their assigned tasks and clock out, I stayed late analyzing market trends, developing campaign strategies that weren't even in my job description, and teaching myself skills that nobody had asked me to learn. Within a year, I'd helped launch 3 successful product campaigns that increased company revenue by 30%. Within 2 years, I was essentially running the marketing department, while still carrying the coordinator title. My boss Dave was happy to take credit for my innovations in board meetings, while keeping my salary embarrassingly low, but I didn't care about the recognition or even the money yet. I was building a foundation, creating a track record, preparing for something bigger. The Stanford acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday in March. I'd been working toward this moment for 3 years, studying for the GMAT during lunch breaks, crafting application essays late into the night, collecting recommendation letters from professors who still remembered the quiet girl who always turned in exceptional work. The full-ride scholarship offer was based on a business plan I'd developed for sustainable tech solutions in emerging markets. It wasn't just acceptance, it was validation that everything I'd been working toward had meaning. I called my parents immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed their number. "Mom, I have incredible news, I said when she picked up. I got into Stanford's MBA program, and they're offering me a full scholarship. There was a pause that stretched too long. That's nice, honey, she finally said. Did you remember to pick up your dry cleaning? I don't want you showing up to work looking unprofessional. The conversation lasted 30 seconds before she had to go, because Emma was having a crisis about her latest art project. I tried my dad next. His response was even worse. Jordan, you know how these programs work, he said with that patronizing tone he'd perfected over the years. They accept way more people than they can actually handle. Don't get your hopes up too high, and besides, you've got a decent job already. Why rock the boat? When I explained it was Stanford, one of the top business schools in the country, he chuckled. Sweetheart, schools like that aren't for people like us. You're setting yourself up for disappointment. But I refused to let their doubt infect my excitement. I planned to announce it properly at our weekly family dinner, the sacred Sunday tradition where we all gathered at my parents' house in Highlands Ranch to catch up and connect. I imagined their faces when they realized the magnitude of what I'd accomplished, how maybe this would finally be the moment they saw me as more than just reliable, responsible Jordan who never caused problems. I should have known better. That Sunday I waited until we were all seated around the familiar oak dining table, the one where I'd done homework while my siblings got help with theirs, where I'd eaten countless meals in relative silence, while Tyler regaled everyone with stories of his latest achievements. I took a deep breath and made my announcement about Stanford, about the scholarship, about the opportunity to study at one of the most prestigious institutions in the world. The silence that followed was deafening. Then my mother delivered that devastating verdict. You'll never be enough. Not congratulations, not excitement, not even curiosity about what this might mean for my future, just a flat declaration that I was inherently insufficient, spoken with the casual cruelty that only family can achieve. My father's follow-up about bringing me back down to earth felt like a physical blow. Here I was, having achieved something that should have made them proud, something that proved I was capable of extraordinary things, and their response was to actively tear me down. Tyler's smirk told me he was enjoying watching me get put in my place. Emma's phone scrolling said I wasn't even worth her momentary attention. I finished my dinner in silence, my appetite gone but my pride intact. I wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of seeing me break down. Instead, I smiled politely, helped clear the dishes like always, and drove back to my downtown loft with my mind already spinning toward what would happen next. They thought I'd never be enough. I was about to show them what enough actually looked like. The next morning, I walked into Dave's office and submitted my formal resignation, 2 weeks' notice, professionally written, with a comprehensive handover document that detailed every project I'd been managing and every system I'd created. His face went pale as he realized how much of the department's success had been quietly orchestrated by the coordinator he'd been systematically undervaluing. Jordan, let's talk about this, he stammered. Maybe we can discuss a promotion, a raise. You're too valuable to lose. I smiled the same polite smile I'd given my family the night before. I appreciate the offer, Dave, but I'm moving on to something bigger. I didn't mention Stanford yet. That announcement would come later, when I was ready to make it count. Those 2 weeks were revelatory. Colleagues who had barely acknowledged me suddenly realized how much I'd been contributing to their success. Projects started falling behind schedule. Campaigns lost their strategic edge. The smooth operation I'd been maintaining behind the scenes began to show cracks the moment I stepped back from my role as the invisible problem solver. Meanwhile, I was busy preparing
and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
For the next phase of my transformation, I reached out to my network, the professional connections I'd been quietly cultivating even while my family dismissed my career as just a job. I scheduled informational interviews with Stanford alumni, researched housing options in Palo Alto, and began the process of applying for the additional grants and fellowships that would not just cover my living expenses but allow me to focus entirely on my studies. The most satisfying moment came during my exit interview with HR. "We had no idea you were handling so many high-level responsibilities," the director admitted as she reviewed my handover documentation. "Your title really didn't reflect your actual contributions to the company." I nodded graciously. "That's why I'm leaving," I said simply. "Sometimes you have to go where your value is recognized." I gave myself a week between jobs to decompress and plan. I spent those days hiking in the foothills west of Denver, thinking about the path that had led me here and the journey that lay ahead. My phone buzzed occasionally with texts from Tyler and Emma, casual messages that ignored the elephant in the room from Sunday dinner. My parents remained silent, which somehow felt worse than their dismissal, but their silence was about to be broken in a way none of us expected. The local news station had been running a series called Colorado Success Stories, featuring young professionals who were making an impact in the. Somehow my name had come up in the. Maybe it was my boss's recommendation, or perhaps one of my professors had submitted my story. Whatever the source, they wanted to do a feature on my journey from community college to Stanford MBA. I almost said no. The last thing I wanted was publicity that might seem like I was bragging or trying to prove a point to my family. But then I realized this wasn't about them anymore. This was about inspiring other people who might be struggling with doubt, who might have their own families telling them they'd never be enough. If my story could help even one person believe in themselves the way I was finally learning to believe in myself, then the discomfort of being in the spotlight would be worth it. The interview took place at my loft, with the Denver skyline visible through the floor-to-ceiling windows I'd fallen in love with when I first toured the apartment. The reporter, a woman named Lisa Chen, was warm and professional as she asked about my background, my education, my career path and my plans for Stanford. I told her about the scholarship, about my business plan for sustainable tech solutions, about my dreams of eventually starting a company that could create meaningful change in underserved communities. What I didn't tell her about was my family's reaction to my acceptance. That story was too raw, too personal to share with strangers. Instead, I focused on the positive, the mentors who had supported me, the opportunities I'd been given, the excitement I felt about the future. The interview lasted 2 hours, and by the end of it I felt lighter somehow, as if speaking my dreams out loud had made them more real. The segment was scheduled to air the following Friday during the evening news. I didn't tell my family about it. Part of me wanted it to be a surprise, but a bigger part of me wasn't sure I could handle their reaction if I warned them in advance. Better to let the story speak for itself. Friday evening I was at home making dinner when my phone started buzzing. First a text from my college friend Sarah, who still lived in Denver. "Oh my God, is that you on Channel 7? Then another from a former coworker. Then my landlord, who had apparently seen the news and wanted to congratulate me. Within an hour I had dozens of messages from people I hadn't heard from in years, all celebrating my success and wishing me well at Stanford. But the call I was waiting for never came. No congratulations from my parents, no excited messages from Tyler or Emma, just silence from the people who should have been proudest of all. That silence stretched into the weekend, then into the following week. I went about my daily routine of preparing for my move to California, selling furniture I wouldn't need, researching professors whose classes I wanted to take, connecting with other incoming MBA students through online forums. My life was moving forward at an accelerating pace, but my family remained frozen in their own expectations of who I was supposed to be. It was Tyler who finally broke the silence, but not in the way I'd hoped. The text came on a Wednesday morning while I was packing books into boxes for my upcoming move to Palo Alto. Tyler's message was brief and cutting, exactly the kind of communication I'd learned to expect from him over the years. Saw your little TV appearance. Really need to make everything about yourself, don't you? Mom and Dad are embarrassed that you're bragging to strangers about things you haven't even done yet. I stared at the message for a long moment, feeling that familiar knot form in my stomach. Even now, when I was preparing to attend one of the world's most prestigious business schools, Tyler had found a way to diminish my achievement and make me feel guilty for sharing it. The fact that he called it bragging when I'd been nothing but humble and gracious during the interview showed me exactly how determined he was to keep me in the box they'd all built for me. But something had shifted in me since that dinner 3 months ago. Maybe it was the scholarship validation, or maybe it was finally seeing my story reflected back to me through an objective observer's eyes during the news interview. Whatever it was, I felt a clarity I'd never experienced before. I wasn't going to apologize for my success anymore. I wasn't going to shrink myself to make other people comfortable. I screenshot Tyler's message, not out of malice, but because I wanted to remember this moment. The moment when I realized that no achievement would ever be enough for them if it threatened their narrative about who I was supposed to be. Then I deleted his number from my phone. If he wanted to communicate with me going forward, he could send a letter. The next week brought an unexpected visitor to my loft. I was reviewing course catalogs when my building's concierge called to let me know someone was asking to come up. Says she's your sister Emma. The voice crackled through the intercom. I paused, surprised. Emma had never visited my apartment in the 3 years I'd lived there. Our relationship had always been distant, maintained through family gatherings and the occasional text about birthdays or holidays. When I opened the door, Emma looked smaller than I remembered, younger somehow despite being 24 years old. She stood in the hallway fidgeting with her purse strap, avoiding eye contact in that way that had always characterized our interactions. "Can I come in?" she asked quietly. "I wanted to talk to you about something." I stepped aside and gestured her into the living room, where half-packed boxes created a maze around my furniture. She perched on the edge of my couch, looking around at the space I'd created for myself with obvious surprise. "This place is really nice," she said, and I could hear genuine admiration in her voice. "I never realized you were doing so well." That comment stung more than she probably intended. We lived in the same city, attended the same family dinners every week, yet somehow she'd never bothered to learn anything about my actual life. But I kept my expression neutral, waiting to see why she'd really come. "I wanted to apologize," Emma continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "For Sunday dinner, for not saying anything when Mom and Dad were so awful to you. I should have stood up for you. But I just froze. I always freeze when there's conflict, and I know that's not an excuse, but I felt terrible afterward." I settled into the chair across from her, studying her face. This was the longest conversation we'd had in years, and certainly the most honest. "Why didn't you call sooner?" I asked. "It's been 3 months, Emma's cheeks flushed, "because I was scared you'd be angry with me. And because I kept thinking maybe Mom and Dad would come around, that they'd realize how incredible your Stanford acceptance really is." But then Tyler told us about the news interview, and instead of being proud, they just got more upset. "Dad kept saying you were showing off, making the family look bad by talking to reporters." The familiar surge of frustration rose in my chest, but I pushed it down. Getting angry wouldn't help anything, and Emma was at least trying to bridge the gap between us. "What did you think about the interview?" I asked instead. For the first time since she'd arrived, Emma met my eyes directly. "I thought you looked amazing. Confident and successful and happy." I recorded it on my phone, because I wanted to show people my sister was going to Stanford, but then I realized I'd never actually told anyone about your acceptance because Mom and Dad acted like it wasn't a big deal. The sadness in her voice made my chest tight. This was what our family's dysfunction had created, a situation where Emma felt she couldn't celebrate her sister's achievements because our parents had deemed them unworthy of celebration. "Emma, you can be proud of me without their permission," I said gently. You don't need mom and dad's approval to have your own feelings about things. She nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand. I know that now, that's actually why I came. I wanted you to know that I think what you're doing is incredible, and I'm sorry it took me so long to say it. Also, I wanted to give you something. Emma reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package. Inside was a delicate silver bracelet with a single charm, a tiny graduation cap. I bought this when you graduated from UC Denver, she explained. I was going to give it to you at the family dinner afterward, but then Tyler dominated the whole conversation talking about his promotion, and Mom kept checking her phone, and it just didn't feel like the right moment. I've been carrying it around ever since, waiting for a better time that never came. I turned the bracelet over in my hands, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift and saddened by the story behind it. How many moments like this had we all missed because our family's dynamics made genuine connection feel impossible? Thank you, I said, fastening the bracelet around my wrist. This means more than you know. We talked for another hour, and I learned things about Emma that I'd never known despite growing up in the same house. Her art wasn't just a hobby, she was actually building a career as a freelance graphic designer, with several regular clients and dreams of eventually opening her own studio. Her anxiety wasn't the fragile, helpless condition our parents treated it as, but something she was actively managing through therapy and meditation. She'd been in a serious relationship for over a year with someone our parents had never met because she was afraid they'd find something wrong with him. I think I've been hiding from my own life, Emma admitted as she prepared to leave. Watching you take this leap to Stanford is making me realize how much I've been playing small to keep everyone else comfortable. After she left, I sat in my partially packed living room thinking about the conversation. Emma's visit had been a gift, not just because of the bracelet or even the apology, but because it showed me that change was possible. If Emma could step outside the family narrative enough to see my achievements clearly, maybe there was hope for other relationships too. But that hope was tested the very next day when my phone rang with a call from my mother. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won out. Her voice when I picked up was tight with barely controlled anger. Jordan, we need to talk. Your father and I are very disappointed in how you've been handling this whole Stanford situation. Going on television making announcements without talking to us first, it's very disrespectful. We raised you better than that. I took a deep breath, reminding myself of the clarity I'd found over the past few months. What exactly was disrespectful about sharing my academic achievement in an interview about local success stories? I asked calmly. Don't take that tone with me, she snapped. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Making us look like we don't support our own daughter, talking to strangers about your personal business, acting like you're better than your family just because some school accepted you. The irony of her complaint was breathtaking. She was upset that I'd made them look unsupportive when they had literally told me I'd never be enough, but pointing that out would only escalate the conflict, and I was tired of fighting for scraps of validation from people who seemed determined to withhold it. Mom, I never said anything negative about you or Dad in that interview. I talked about my education, my career goals, and my excitement about the future. If that somehow reflects poorly on you, maybe you should ask yourself why. The silence that followed was arctic. When she spoke again, her voice was ice cold. I think you need to remember where you come from, Jordan. Stanford or no Stanford, you're still our daughter, and you still need to show respect for your family. This attitude of yours is very ugly. I felt something crack inside me, not with pain but with relief. The spell was finally broken. For 28 years, I'd been trying to earn love and approval from people who had decided I wasn't worthy of either. No amount of achievement would ever change that, because the problem wasn't my worthiness. The problem was their inability to see it. You're right, Mom, I am your daughter, and I deserved better than being told I'd never be enough when I shared the biggest achievement of my life. I deserved celebration, not dismissal. I deserved support, not sabotage. And if you can't see that, then maybe the problem isn't my attitude. I ended the call before she could respond, then immediately turned off my phone. I needed space to process what had just happened, to sit with the finality of drawing a line I'd never drawn before. The rest of that week passed in a strange sort of peace. Without the constant weight of family disappointment pressing down on me, I found myself moving through my days with an energy I hadn't felt in years. I finished packing my apartment, confirmed my housing arrangements at Stanford, and even started outlining the business plan I wanted to develop further once classes began. On Friday, I treated myself to dinner at my favorite restaurant in Lodo, a small Italian place where I'd celebrated every personal milestone that my family had ignored. As I sat at my usual corner table with a glass of wine and a plate of homemade pasta, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Jordan, this is your Aunt Patricia. I saw your interview on the news and wanted to reach out. I had no idea you were going to Stanford, and I'm absolutely thrilled for you. I know your parents are proud but may be having trouble expressing it. Would you like to have coffee sometime before you leave for California? I'd love to hear more about your plans." I stared at the message, surprised by the rush of emotion it triggered. Aunt Patricia was my father's younger sister, someone I'd always liked but rarely saw outside of major holidays. The idea that she'd reached out, that she'd used the word thrilled to describe my achievement, felt like water in the desert. I typed back immediately. "I would love that. Thank you so much for reaching out." We met the next afternoon at a coffee shop in Cherry Creek, and I was struck by how different the conversation felt from any family interaction I'd had in months. Patricia listened with genuine interest as I described my business plan, asked thoughtful questions about my goals, and shared stories about her own career journey as a marketing executive for a major Denver corporation. "I have to tell you," she said as we were finishing our second cups of coffee, "I've always admired your independence. Even as a kid, you had this quiet determination that impressed me. I'm not surprised you've achieved something like this, but I am surprised your parents aren't shouting it from the rooftops." I felt my throat tighten. "They think I'm getting too big for my britches, I guess." Patricia frowned, stirring her coffee thoughtfully. "Your father has always struggled with change. He's spent his whole life in the same job, the same house, the same routines. Sometimes I think other people's ambitions scare him because they highlight the choices he didn't make, but that's his issue to work through, not yours to accommodate." Her words felt like permission to stop carrying guilt that had never belonged to me. We talked for another hour, and when we finally parted ways, she hugged me tightly and whispered, "Make us proud at Stanford. I'll be bragging about my brilliant niece to everyone who'll listen." That evening, I sat in my nearly empty loft and drafted an email to my parents. I'd thought about writing it dozens of times over the past months, but I'd never been able to find the right words. Now, with Patricia's encouragement still warm in my memory and my departure for California just
2 weeks away, the words came easily. "Mom and Dad, I want you to know that despite everything that's happened, I love you both. I always will. But I also need you to understand that I'm moving forward with my life, with or without your support. I've worked too hard and come too far to let anyone else's limitations define what's possible for me. If someday you decide you want to be part of my journey instead of standing in its way, I'll be here. Until then, I wish you well." I didn't send it immediately. Instead, I saved it to my drafts folder and decided to sleep on it. Some things were better said face to face, even if the conversation would be difficult. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. The next morning, Emma called to let me know that our grandmother Rose was in the hospital. She'd fallen at her assisted living facility and broken her hip, and the whole family was gathering to visit her. "I know things are weird right now," Emma said carefully, "but Grandma's been asking for you specifically. She saw the news interview and keeps telling everyone how proud she is." My grandmother had always been different from my parents, warmer and more encouraging. She'd been the one to slip me $20 for books when I was in community college, the one who'd asked about my classes and remembered the names of my professors. If she was asking for me, I couldn't stay away, family drama or not. The hospital was sterile and bright, filled with the familiar sounds and smells that always made me anxious. I found my family clustered in the waiting area outside the cardiac wing, my parents sitting stiffly in adjoining chairs while Tyler paced near the windows. Emma spotted me first and hurried over with relief clear on her face. "Thank God you came," she whispered. "Grandma's been stable, but the surgery is more complicated because of her age. She's been in and out of consciousness, but every time she wakes up, she asks if Jordan is here yet." My parents looked up when they heard my name, and I saw something flicker across my mother's face that might have been relief or regret. My father just nodded curtly and returned his attention to his phone. Tyler didn't acknowledge me at all. The tension in that waiting room was thick enough to cut. But I didn't care about my own comfort anymore. I was there for my grandmother, the one person in my family who had consistently shown me unconditional love and support. When the nurse finally said I could see her, I walked into that hospital room with my heart in my throat. Grandma Rose looked so small in the big mechanical bed, connected to machines that beeped and whirred around her. But when she saw me, her eyes lit up with the same warmth they'd always held. "There's my Stanford girl," she said, her voice weak but unmistakably proud. "Come here and tell me everything." I pulled a chair close to her bed and took her hand, feeling the paper-thin skin and prominent veins that spoke of her 87 years. For the next hour, I told her about my plans for business school, about the professors I hoped to study with, about the company I dreamed of starting someday. She listened with the kind of attention that made me feel like the most important person in the world. "I always knew you were special," she said, when I finished. "Even when you were little, you had this fire in you that couldn't be put out. Your parents, they mean well, but they've never understood that some people are meant for bigger things. Don't let their fears make you smaller, Jordan. Promise me that." I squeezed her hand gently. "I promise, Grandma." She smiled and closed her eyes, and I thought she might be drifting off to sleep. But then she spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I have something for you. In my jewelry box at home, there's a pearl necklace that belonged to my mother. I want you to have it. Something to remember that you come from a long line of strong women, even if they didn't all get the chances you're getting." Tears blurred my vision as I promised to treasure the necklace. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, her hand in mine, until a nurse came to check her vitals and suggested I let her rest. Walking back to the waiting room felt like crossing a minefield. I could feel my parents' eyes on me, could sense the questions and accusations they were holding back out of respect for the hospital setting. When I announced that I was leaving, my mother finally spoke. "We should talk," she said quietly. "All of us, this situation has gone on long enough." I looked at her tired face, at my father's stubborn expression, at Tyler's obvious discomfort with the whole scene. Part of me wanted to agree, to try one more time to make them understand. But I'd spent too many years chasing their approval to waste more time on an impossible goal. "There's nothing left to talk about," I said, not unkindly but with finality. "You've made your position clear, and I've made mine. I hope Grandma's surgery goes well, and I hope someday you'll be able to see me the way she does. But I'm not going to wait around for that day anymore." I kissed Emma goodbye, nodded politely to my parents, and walked out of that hospital knowing it was the last time I'd put myself in a position to be hurt by their rejection. 2 weeks later, I was loading the last of my belongings into my car for the drive to California when my phone rang with news that Grandma Rose had died peacefully in her sleep. The funeral was scheduled for the following week, just days before my Stanford orientation was set to begin. I drove back to Denver for the service, knowing it would mean seeing my family again, but unable to miss the chance to say goodbye to the woman who had believed in me when no one else would. The funeral home was packed with people whose lives my grandmother had touched over her 87 years, and I was struck by the number of stories shared about her kindness, her wisdom, her ability to see the best in everyone. During the reception afterward, Emma found me standing alone near the memory table, looking at photos of our grandmother through the decades. She left something for you, Emma said, pressing a small velvet box into my hands. Inside was the pearl necklace Grandma Rose had promised me, along with a note in her familiar handwriting. Jordan, wear these and remember that you are enough, exactly as you are. You always have been. Love always, Grandma. I fastened the necklace around my neck right there in the funeral home, feeling its weight settle against my collarbone like a blessing. When I looked up, I saw my parents watching from across the room, their expressions unreadable. For a moment, I thought one of them might approach, might finally bridge the gap that had grown so wide between us. But the moment passed, and they turned away to speak with other relatives. I realized then that some people are too invested in their version of who you are to ever accept who you're becoming, and that was okay. I didn't need their acceptance anymore. I had something more valuable, the knowledge of my own worth and the courage to claim it. The next morning, I loaded my car again and drove west toward my new life, my grandmother's pearls catching the sunlight through the windshield, and my heart finally, completely free. Stanford's campus in August was everything I'd imagined and more. The sandstone buildings glowed golden in the California sunshine, palm trees swayed gently in the warm breeze, and everywhere I looked, there were brilliant minds preparing to change the world. Walking across the quad with my orientation packet in hand, I felt like I was finally where I belonged. My dorm room in the graduate housing complex was small but efficient, with a view of the courtyard where other MBA students were already gathering in animated conversations about their backgrounds and aspirations. As I unpacked my belongings, carefully placing my grandmother's framed photo on the desk and her pearl necklace in the jewelry box I'd brought from home, I thought about how far I'd traveled to get here, not just in miles but in understanding of my own worth. The first week was a whirlwind of orientations, meet and greets, and initial course selections. I was struck by the diversity of my classmates, people who'd come from investment banks in New York, tech startups in Seattle, consulting firms in London, and social enterprises in places I'd never heard of. Everyone had a story of achievement and ambition, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel like I had to apologize for mine. During one of the mixer events, I found myself in conversation with a woman named Priya, who'd left a successful career in biotech to pursue her dream of developing affordable medical devices for rural communities. As she described her vision with passionate intensity, I was reminded of my own business plan and the sustainable tech solutions I hope to bring to underserved markets. "What's your background?" Priya asked, and I found myself telling my story without the usual hesitation or downplaying that had become second nature around my family. I talked about my journey from community college to my marketing career, about the scholarship that had brought me here, about my dreams of building something meaningful. Priya listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights from her own experience. "That's incredible," she said when I finished. "You're exactly the kind of person this place needs, someone with real-world experience and a clear vision for impact. I hope we end up in some classes together." It was such a simple interaction, but it left me feeling validated in a way I hadn't experienced in months. Here was someone who saw my background as an asset, not a limitation, who understood that the unconventional path I'd taken was actually a source of strength. My first class was corporate strategy with Professor Williams, a former McKinsey partner known for her rigorous case method approach. As I walked into the amphitheater-style classroom, I felt a familiar flutter of nerves mixed with excitement. The other students were already settling into their seats, laptops open and ready, the air buzzing with intellectual energy. Professor Williams began the session by cold calling students to analyze a complex business scenario involving a struggling retail chain. When she called my name halfway through the class, I felt my heart rate spike, but I'd done my homework thoroughly and had strong opinions about the company's strategic options. "Miss Mitchell," she said, fixing me with her intense gaze, "what would you recommend this company do about their digital transformation challenges?" I took a breath and launched into my analysis, drawing not just on the case study materials, but on my real-world experience, watching companies struggle with similar transitions.
I talked about the importance of understanding customer behavior data, the risks of trying to change too much too quickly, and the need for leadership alignment before implementing new technologies. The room was silent as I spoke, and I could feel my classmates' attention focused on my words. When I finished, Professor Williams nodded approvingly. Excellent analysis, Miss Mitchell. It's clear you've seen these challenges firsthand. Can anyone build on Miss Mitchell's points about customer data? The discussion that followed was invigorating, with students building on each other's ideas and challenging assumptions in ways that pushed everyone's thinking forward. I contributed several more times throughout the class, feeling more confident with each interaction. This was what I'd been hungry for all my life: intellectual stimulation and respect for my ideas. After class, several students approached me to continue the conversation, and I found myself at the center of a group discussion about digital marketing strategies over coffee. It was surreal to be treated as an expert rather than someone who needed to prove herself, to have my insights valued rather than dismissed. That evening, I called Emma to share my excitement about the first day. She answered on the second ring, and I could hear the genuine warmth in her voice as she asked about every detail of my classes, my classmates, and my impressions of the campus. "You sound so happy," she said when I paused to breathe. "I haven't heard you sound like this in years, maybe ever. It's like you're finally yourself." Her observation hit me deeply because it was absolutely true. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't performing a version of myself designed to avoid conflict or seek approval. I was simply being Jordan, the ambitious, intelligent, driven woman I'd always been underneath the layers of family expectations and self-doubt. "How are things at home?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Emma's pause told me everything. "Tense," she admitted. "Mom and Dad keep asking if I've heard from you, but they won't actually call you themselves. Tyler acts like nothing happened, but I think he's realized he might have pushed too far. And honestly, I think they're all starting to understand what they lost when you left." "What do you mean?" "Well, remember how you used to handle all the family coordination, birthday planning, holiday arrangements, keeping track of everyone's schedules? Nobody's doing that anymore. Dad's birthday last month was a disaster because everyone thought someone else was organizing it. And Mom's been complaining that nobody calls to check on them anymore, but she doesn't seem to connect that to the fact that you were the one who initiated most of those calls." I felt a complex mix of sadness and vindication at Emma's words. It was validating to hear that my contributions had been noticed, even if only in their absence, but it was also heartbreaking that it had taken my complete withdrawal for them to recognize what I'd been giving. "I miss them," I admitted, "but I don't miss feeling invisible and unappreciated." "I know," Emma said softly. "And I think they're starting to miss more than just what you did for them. I think they miss you." We talked for another few minutes before I had to go prepare for my next day's classes. As I hung up the phone, I felt the familiar pang of longing for family connection, but it was tempered now by a sense of peace about my choices. I'd created space for myself to grow, and I was finally beginning to understand who I could become when I wasn't constantly trying to earn love that should have been freely given. The weeks flew by in a blur of case studies, team projects, and networking events. I threw myself into the academic work with an intensity that surprised even me, staying up late to perfect presentations and arriving early to office hours to dig deeper into concepts that fascinated me. My professors began to recognize me as a serious student, and my classmates started seeking out my perspective on group assignments. One of the most transformative experiences came during a class on social entrepreneurship, where we were tasked with developing a business plan for a venture that could create both profit and positive social impact. I'd been thinking about this concept since my application essays, but now I had access to resources and expertise that could help me refine my ideas. I decided to focus on developing affordable solar energy solutions for rural communities in developing countries, drawing on my marketing background to address the customer acquisition challenges that many social enterprises faced. As I dove into the research, interviewing experts, and analyzing market data, I felt a sense of purpose that went beyond personal achievement. My professor for the class, Dr. Reginald Kim, was a former Peace Corps volunteer who'd built several successful social enterprises before joining Stanford's faculty. He was known for his tough feedback and high expectations, so when he asked me to stay after class one afternoon, I braced myself for criticism. "Jordan," he said, settling behind his desk with my latest assignment in front of him, "I wanted to talk to you about your solar project proposal. This is some of the most thoughtful market analysis I've seen from a first-year student." I felt a flush of pride at his words. "Thank you, Dr. Kim, I've been really passionate about this concept. It shows, but more than that, your background in traditional marketing gives you insights that a lot of social entrepreneurs miss. You understand customer psychology and go-to-market strategy in ways that could make a real difference in this space." He leaned forward, his expression becoming more intense. "I want you to consider applying for our summer fellowship program with the Global Social Innovation Institute. It's competitive, but it would give you funding to actually pilot this concept in partnership with organizations in Kenya and Guatemala." I stared at him, hardly believing what I was hearing. A few months ago, my own family had told me I'd never be enough, and now a Stanford professor was suggesting I had the potential to create real change on a global scale. "I would be honored to apply," I managed to say. "Good. The application deadline is next month, and I'd be happy to write you a recommendation. Start thinking about how you'd structure a pilot program and what metrics you'd use to measure success." Walking back to my dorm room that afternoon, I felt like I was floating. This was what I'd dreamed of when I'd first started planning my path to business school, the opportunity to combine my skills with my values to create something meaningful. The fact that it was happening so quickly, that professors were already recognizing my potential, felt almost surreal. That evening, I found myself drafting an email to my parents for the third time since arriving at Stanford. Each previous attempt had ended up in my drafts folder, the words never quite capturing what I wanted to say, but Dr. Kim's encouragement had given me a confidence I hadn't felt before, and I wanted to share this moment with them, even if they hadn't shared in my journey so far. "Dear Mom and Dad," I wrote, "I wanted to let you know how my first month at Stanford has been going. I'm thriving here in ways I never imagined possible. My professors are encouraging me to pursue research that could have real global impact, and I'm surrounded by people who challenge and support me every day. I know we haven't spoken since I left Denver, and I understand if you're not ready to hear from me yet, but I wanted you to know that I'm becoming the person I always hoped I could be, and I wish you could be proud of that journey, even if you weren't able to support it initially." I saved the email to my drafts folder again, not quite ready to send it but closer than I'd been before. Some bridges required more than good intentions to rebuild, they needed time and possibly a different approach altogether. The fellowship application consumed my free time for the next 3 weeks. I researched market conditions in Kenya and Guatemala, developed financial projections for a sustainable business model, and crafted a proposal that I hoped would demonstrate both my analytical skills and my genuine commitment to social impact. Professor Kim met with me twice to review drafts, offering suggestions that strengthened my arguments and helped me refine my approach. "You're thinking like an entrepreneur," he said, during our final review session. "Too many students in this program think like consultants, analyzing problems without taking ownership of solutions. You're different, you see a challenge and immediately start thinking about how to build something to address it." His words stayed with me as I submitted the application, and I realized he'd identified something essential about my character that my family had never recognized. I wasn't content to be a passive observer or even a helpful supporter of other people's visions. I was someone who saw problems and felt compelled to create solutions. 2 weeks after submitting my fellowship application, I received an email that would change everything. The subject line was simple, "Fellowship Award Notification," but when I opened it, the words seemed to jump off the screen. "Congratulations, Jordan, we are pleased to inform you that you have been selected as one of 10 recipients of this year's Global Social Innovation Fellowship. Your proposal for sustainable solar solutions demonstrated exceptional market insight and innovative thinking about customer acquisition challenges in emerging markets." I read the email 3 times before it fully sank in. Not only had I been accepted, but the fellowship came with $25,000 in funding, mentorship from successful social entrepreneurs, and partnerships with established organizations in both countries where I'd proposed to work. I immediately called Emma, who screamed so loudly when I told her the news that her roommate came running to check on her. "Jordan, this is incredible, you're going to change the world. I can't believe my sister is going to be running her own international organization." Her excitement was infectious, and for the first time since leaving Denver, I found myself wishing I could share this moment with my parents. This wasn't just a personal achievement, it was validation of everything I'd believed about my own potential, proof that the dreams they'd dismissed as unrealistic were actually the foundation for something extraordinary. That night, I sat in my dorm room, looking out at the California stars and thought about my grandmother Rose. She'd always told me I was meant for big things, even when no one else could see it. I wished she were still alive to hear about the fellowship, to know that her faith in me had been justified. The next morning brought an email that stopped me cold. The sender was my father, the first direct communication I'd received from either parent since moving to California. The subject line read, "Congratulations," and I stared at it for several minutes before finding the courage to open it. "Jordan," it began, "Emma told us about your fellowship award, and I wanted to reach out to congratulate you. I also wanted to apologize for how we handled the news about Stanford. Your mother and I have done a lot of thinking over the past few months, and we realize we let our own fears and limitations cloud our judgment about your achievements. We were wrong to dismiss your dreams, and we were wrong to make you feel like you weren't enough. You've always been more than enough, and we're sorry it took your success at Stanford for us to see it clearly. If you're willing, we'd like to talk. We miss you, and we're proud of you. Love, Dad." I read the email several times, feeling a complex swirl of emotions. Relief that they'd finally acknowledged their mistakes. Anger that it had taken such dramatic external validation for them to recognize my worth. Sadness that so much damage had been done to our relationship, and underneath it all, a cautious hope that maybe healing was possible. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I printed out the email and tucked it into my journal, next to the fellowship notification and a photo of my grandmother. Some moments were too important to exist only in digital form, they needed to be tangible, something I could hold and return to when I needed reminding of how far I'd come. 3 days later, I called my father. The conversation was awkward at first, both of us navigating the strange territory of honesty after years of surface-level interactions. He asked about my classes, my fellowship plans, my experience at Stanford. I told him about the professors who'd become mentors, the classmates who'd become friends, the sense of purpose I'd discovered in my work. "I wish we could have been part of supporting this journey from the beginning," he said quietly. "I think we were so worried about you getting hurt or disappointed that we forgot to consider how much we were hurting you ourselves." "I needed to do this on my own anyway," I replied, and I realized it was true. I needed to prove to myself that I was capable of extraordinary things, not just to you and Mom, but to me. If you'd supported me from the start, I might never have developed the independence and resilience that have gotten me this far. We talked for over an hour, and while it didn't erase the pain of the past months, it felt like the beginning of a new chapter in our relationship. When we finally said goodbye, he promised to call again soon, and for the first time in years, I believed him. That weekend, I drove up to San Francisco to meet with potential partner organizations for my fellowship project. The meetings were productive and energizing, but what struck me most was how naturally I fit into these conversations with established entrepreneurs and nonprofit leaders. 6 months ago, I'd been the invisible marketing coordinator in a Denver startup. Now I was discussing international business strategy with people who'd built organizations that served millions of people. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was personal. I carried myself differently now, spoke with confidence about my ideas and capabilities, took up space in conversations without apologizing for it. I'd finally learned the difference between being humble and making myself small, between being respectful and being invisible. Driving back to campus that evening, as the sun set over the Pacific, I thought about the girl who'd sat in her parents' dining room 6 months earlier, listening to them tell her she'd never be enough. She could never have imagined this moment, this life, this version of herself, who was preparing to launch an international social enterprise before finishing her first year of graduate school. But maybe that girl had always been there underneath, waiting for permission to emerge. Maybe all she'd needed was distance from the voices that told her to stay small, and proximity to voices that told her to dream big. Maybe becoming more than my family could ever imagine wasn't about changing who I was, but about finally allowing myself to be who I'd always been meant to be. As I pulled into the Stanford parking lot, my phone buzzed with a text from Emma. Just booked my flight to visit you next month, can't wait to see your new world in person and meet all these
amazing people who actually appreciate my incredible sister. I smiled, thinking about how much had changed and how much healing was still possible. Some relationships could be repaired, some couldn't, but the most important relationship, the one I had with myself, was finally unbreakable. And that, I realized, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Emma's visit to Stanford came at the perfect time. I was deep into the planning phase of my fellowship project, spending long hours in the library researching solar technology implementations and drafting partnership agreements with organizations in Kenya and Guatemala. When I picked her up at San Francisco International Airport, I was struck by how different she looked. There was a confidence in her posture that hadn't been there during her apologetic visit to my Denver loft months earlier. "Jordan?" she called out, practically bouncing as she spotted me in the arrivals area. "I can't believe I'm actually here. I've been following Stanford's Instagram account for weeks just to see if I could spot you in any of the campus photos." As we drove south toward Palo Alto, Emma peppered me with questions about everything from the architecture to the academic culture to my daily routine. But what struck me most was her genuine excitement about my achievements. She asked detailed questions about my fellowship project, took notes on her phone when I explained the solar technology components, and even suggested marketing angles I hadn't considered. "You know," she said, as we walked across the main quad toward my dorm, "I've started telling everyone back home about what you're doing. Not just family, but my clients, people at coffee shops, basically anyone who will listen. I think I'm more proud of you than you are of yourself." Her words hit me with unexpected force. Growing up, I'd become so accustomed to downplaying my accomplishments to avoid making others uncomfortable that I'd forgotten what it felt like to have someone genuinely celebrate my successes. Emma's unapologetic pride in my achievements was a gift I hadn't realized I'd been missing. That evening, I took her to a dinner hosted by the Social Entrepreneurship Club, where she got to meet Priya and several other classmates who'd become close friends. Watching Emma interact with my Stanford community was revelatory. She asked thoughtful questions about their projects, shared insights from her own design work, and fit seamlessly into conversations about global development and sustainable business models. "Your sister is incredible," Priya whispered to me during a break in the conversation. "She has such a fresh perspective on user experience design. Has she ever considered applying to business school herself?" I looked across the table at Emma, who was animatedly discussing the intersection of art and social impact with a classmate who'd worked in refugee camps, and realized that my transformation had inspired changes in her as well. The anxious, withdrawn person our parents had treated like fragile glass was nowhere to be seen. Instead, I saw a confident, articulate woman with her own ambitious dreams. The next morning, Emma insisted on sitting in on one of my classes. Professor Williams had graciously agreed to let her audit the corporate strategy session, and I watched nervously as my sister settled into a seat in the back row of the amphitheater. I'd grown comfortable with the intellectual rigor of Stanford's case method, but having family witness this environment felt vulnerable in a way I hadn't anticipated. The class discussion centered on a complex merger scenario, and I found myself called upon twice to analyze different aspects of the deal structure. Each time,
I drew on both the case study materials and my practical marketing experience to provide analysis that seemed to resonate with both Professor Williams and my classmates. When the class ended, Emma was practically glowing. "Jordan, that was incredible," she said as we walked toward the campus coffee shop. "The way you commanded that room, the respect in everyone's voices when they responded to your points, it was like watching someone I'd never met before. But also exactly like the person I always knew you could be." Her observation captured something I'd been feeling but couldn't articulate. Stanford hadn't changed who I was fundamentally, it had simply provided an environment where my authentic self could finally emerge without apology. The intellectual curiosity, the strategic thinking, the leadership instincts had all been there before, buried under layers of family expectations and self-doubt. That afternoon, we drove up to San Francisco so Emma could see the city, and so I could introduce her to Dr. Martinez, one of my fellowship mentors who ran a sustainable development nonprofit in the Mission District. Dr. Martinez had agreed to meet with us at her organization's offices, where she was overseeing the distribution of solar lighting systems to rural communities in Central America. "Emma, it's wonderful to meet you," Dr. Martinez said, warming to my sister immediately. "Jordan has told me so much about your graphic design work. I was hoping you might have some thoughts about how we could improve our community engagement materials." What followed was a 2-hour working session that transformed from a casual introduction into a genuine collaboration. Emma analyzed their current promotional materials with the same sharp eye she brought to her freelance client work, identifying ways to make the messaging more culturally relevant and visually compelling. Dr. Martinez was so impressed that she offered Emma a consulting contract on the spot. "I've been looking for someone who understands both design principles and social impact messaging," Dr. Martinez explained. "Your sister has a rare combination of technical skill and cultural sensitivity that could make a real difference in how we connect with the communities we serve." Driving back to Stanford that evening, Emma was quiet for a long time before finally speaking. "I think I understand now why you had to leave Denver," she said softly. "Not just because of how Mom and Dad treated you, but because you needed space to discover who you really are. Being around you this weekend, seeing how you navigate this world, it's made me realize how much I've been limiting myself to." "What do you mean?" I asked, though I thought I knew. "I've been playing small my whole life just like you were, taking freelance projects that pay the bills but don't challenge me, avoiding opportunities that feel too big or too risky, letting Mom and Dad's anxiety about the world shape my own choices. Watching you build this incredible life from nothing has made me realize I want more for myself too." The conversation that followed was one of the most honest we'd ever had. Emma told me about business ideas she'd been sketching in the margins of her notebooks, about dreams of opening her own studio or maybe even pursuing graduate school herself. I shared my own fears about the fellowship project, about the pressure of potentially failing on such a visible stage, about the loneliness that sometimes came with pursuing a path that none of my family understood. "You know what's funny," Emma said as we pulled into the Stanford visitor parking area. "I used to think you were crazy for wanting more than what we had growing up. Now I think we were both crazy for accepting so little for so long." The rest of Emma's visit passed in a blur of campus tours, late-night conversations, and shared meals with my Stanford friends who universally adored her. On her final morning, we sat in my dorm room, going through the fellowship materials one more time before her flight back to Denver. "I have something for you," she said, pulling a carefully wrapped package from her suitcase. Inside was a hand-painted journal bound in rich leather, with my initials embossed on the cover. "I made this for you to take to Kenya and Guatemala. I wanted you to have something beautiful to record what I know is going to be an amazing journey." I ran my fingers over the smooth cover, touched by the thoughtfulness of the gift and the hours of work it represented. "Emma, this is gorgeous, thank you. There's something else," she said, looking suddenly nervous. I've been thinking about what Dr. Martinez said yesterday about the consulting work. If the offer is real, I want to take it. I want to be part of what you're building, even if it's just in a small way. The idea of having Emma involved in my fellowship project filled me with excitement and trepidation in equal measure. Working with family had obvious complications, but Emma's design skills were genuinely impressive, and her fresh perspective on the community engagement challenges could be invaluable. The offer is absolutely real, I assured her. Dr. Martinez doesn't make casual suggestions, but are you sure you're ready for this kind of work? It's going to be demanding, and there's no guarantee of success. Emma smiled, and for the first time in our lives, I saw the same determined fire in her eyes that I'd been carrying alone for so long. I'm sure. I want to be part of something that matters, something bigger than just making pretty logos for companies I don't care about. I want to work with my sister who's changing the world. After I dropped Emma at the airport, I drove back to campus with my mind spinning. Having her involved in the project would add complexity, but it would also provide something I hadn't realized I was missing, a bridge between my old life and my new one. For the first time since leaving Denver, I wouldn't have to choose between my family relationships and my professional ambitions. The next few weeks brought a flurry of preparation as my fellowship project moved from planning to implementation. I coordinated with partner organizations in both Kenya and Guatemala, finalized equipment specifications with solar technology suppliers, and developed training materials for the community liaison teams who would be installing and maintaining the systems. Emma threw herself into the design work with an intensity that reminded me of my own approach to the Stanford coursework. She created culturally appropriate instructional materials, developed branding for the community education campaigns, and even learned basic Spanish and Swahili so she could better understand the linguistic nuances of the messaging. Our collaboration was surprisingly smooth, despite the family dynamics that had historically complicated our interactions. Working together toward a shared goal seemed to dissolve the old patterns of competition and comparison that had defined our relationship growing up. Instead of the baby sister who needed protection, Emma revealed herself to be a creative partner whose contributions strengthened every aspect of the project. 3 weeks before my departure for Kenya, I received an unexpected phone call that would change everything. The caller identified herself as Rebecca Thompson, a reporter for Forbes magazine who was working on a feature about innovative approaches to international development. "Miss Mitchell," she said, "I've been following your fellowship project through the Stanford press releases, and I'm fascinated by your integrated approach to technology distribution and community engagement. I'd love to feature your work in an upcoming article about young entrepreneurs who are tackling global challenges." The interview took place over video call, and I found myself discussing not just the technical aspects of the solar project, but the broader philosophy behind sustainable development work. Rebecca asked thoughtful questions about my background, my motivations, and my long-term vision for addressing energy poverty in rural communities. "What strikes me about your approach," Rebecca said, toward the end of our conversation, "is how you've combined traditional business principles with genuine cultural sensitivity. Too many development projects fail because they're designed by outsiders who don't understand local needs. Your emphasis on community partnership and local capacity building seems like it could be a model for other initiatives." When the Forbes article was published 2 weeks later, the response was overwhelming. The piece, titled "The New Face of Social Entrepreneurship," featured my project prominently, alongside profiles of other young innovators who were using business principles to address social challenges. The article included photos from my Stanford campus and quotes from Professor Kim and Dr. Martinez about the potential impact of the work. But the most surprising response came from home. My phone rang early on the morning the article went live, and I was startled to see my mother's number on the caller ID. "Jordan," she said when I answered, and I could hear something different in her voice. Not the defensive tone that had characterized our last few conversations, but something softer, more wondering. I just finished reading the Forbes article. I had no idea the scope of what you were doing. It's still early, I said carefully. We haven't implemented anything yet, so there's no guarantee of success. That's not what I mean, she continued. I mean, I had no idea who you'd become. Reading that article, seeing the way these experts talk about your work, your vision, it's like discovering, I have a daughter. You're right, it never knew existed. The conversation that followed was unlike any we'd ever had. My mother asked detailed questions about the fellowship, about my experience at Stanford, about my plans for the future. She listened without interrupting, without offering unsolicited advice, without making the conversation about her own fears or limitations. I owe you an apology that goes deeper than what your father said in his email, she said eventually. We didn't just fail to support your dreams, we actively discouraged them. We made you feel like wanting more than what we had was somehow selfish or unrealistic. But reading about your work, I realize you were never the problem. We were. Tears blurred my vision as I listened to words I'd waited my entire life to hear. Thank you for saying that, Mom. It means everything to me. I want to be part of your life again, she said. Not to take credit for your success, but to support whatever comes next, if you'll let me. The healing that began with that phone call continued over the following weeks as I prepared for my departure to Kenya. Both of my parents started calling regularly, asking about my preparations, and expressing genuine excitement about the project. Tyler even reached out, sending a brief but heartfelt text congratulating me on the Forbes article and acknowledging that he'd been wrong to dismiss my ambitions. Emma's transformation was even more dramatic. Energized by her involvement in the fellowship project, she'd started reaching out to other nonprofit organizations about design consulting work. She'd also begun researching graduate programs in sustainable design, exploring the possibility of pursuing an advanced degree that would allow her to build a career around socially conscious creative work. I think you saved my life, she said during one of our planning calls, not dramatically, but in the sense that you showed me it was possible to want more than just safety and comfort. Watching you take these risks and create something meaningful has given me permission to do the same. The week before my departure, Stanford hosted a send-off event for the fellowship recipients. The gathering included faculty members, staff from partner organizations, and family members who'd traveled to campus for the celebration. I was surprised and deeply moved when both of my parents and Emma walked into the reception hall. Professor Kim introduced each fellow to the assembled group, describing their projects and highlighting the potential impact of their work. When he introduced me, he spoke about the innovative approach I'd taken to community engagement and the collaborative partnerships I'd developed with established organizations. Jordan represents the best of what we hope to achieve through this fellowship program, he said. She's not just bringing technology to underserved communities, she's building sustainable systems that will continue to create value long after her fellowship period ends. Watching my parents' faces during that introduction was profoundly healing. I saw pride there, genuine pride in who I'd become and what I'd accomplished, but more than that, I saw recognition, as if they were finally seeing me clearly for the first time. After the formal presentation, my family joined me and several classmates for dinner at a restaurant in downtown Palo Alto. The conversation flowed easily, with my parents asking thoughtful questions about my classmates' projects and Emma contributing insights from her design work. For the first time in my adult life, I felt like my family and my professional community existed in harmony rather than in conflict. I keep thinking about that dinner last spring, my father said, as we were leaving the restaurant, when we told you that you'd never be enough. I wish I could take back those words, not just because they were cruel, but because they were so completely wrong. You've always been more than enough, Jordan. We were just too limited to see it. My departure for Kenya was scheduled for early Monday morning, and I spent Sunday evening in my dorm room, doing final equipment checks and reviewing the community partnership agreements one more time.
Emma had flown back to Denver the previous day, but not before promising to maintain regular contact throughout my fellowship period and to continue developing the design materials we'd need for the Guatemala phase of the project. As I packed my grandmother's journal into my carry-on bag, I thought about how much had changed since that devastating dinner in my parents' dining room. The girl who'd sat silently while her family dismissed her dreams felt like a different person now, someone I'd once been but had grown beyond. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown international number. "Jordan, this is Samuel from the Kenyan Solar Initiative. We are so excited to welcome you to Nairobi tomorrow. The communities we'll be working with are eager to meet the young woman who is bringing light to their villages. Safe travels, and thank you for choosing to work with us." I smiled, thinking about the communities I'd be serving, the partnerships I'd be building, the systems I'd be creating that could provide sustainable energy access for thousands of people. This was what I'd been working toward, through all the lonely years of trying to prove my worth to people who couldn't see it. But as I settled into bed for my last night at Stanford, before the fellowship deployment, I realized that the greatest transformation hadn't been professional at all. It had been personal. I'd learned to see myself the way my grandmother always had, as someone worthy of love and respect, and big dreams. I'd learned to separate my inherent value from other people's ability to recognize it. The girl who'd been told she'd never be enough had become a woman who understood that she'd always been more than enough. She just needed the courage to claim that truth, and the wisdom to build a life that reflected it. Tomorrow, I would begin the next chapter of that life, bringing light to communities that had been living in darkness, just as I'd learned to bring light to the dark corners of my own self-doubt. The work would be challenging, the outcome uncertain, but I was no longer the person who needed guarantees before taking risks, or permission before pursuing dreams. I was Jordan Mitchell, Stanford MBA fellow, social entrepreneur, and daughter, who'd finally learned that becoming more than your family can imagine sometimes requires the courage to become exactly who you were always meant to be. The air in Nairobi hit me like a wall of warmth and possibility when I stepped off the plane that Monday morning. Samuel from the Kenyan Solar Initiative was waiting at the arrivals gate with a hand-drawn sign bearing my name and a smile that could have powered the entire airport. As we drove through the bustling streets toward my temporary housing, he peppered me with updates about the communities we'd be working with and the local team members who were eager to begin implementation. "Jordan," he said as we navigated the chaotic traffic, "I want you to know that word has spread about your project far beyond the villages we originally planned to reach. Community leaders, from districts we haven't even contacted, are asking when the solar program might expand to their areas. Your approach of training local technicians, rather than just dropping off equipment, has generated tremendous excitement." The accommodation Stanford had arranged was a modest but comfortable guest house in the Westlands district, run by a woman named Grace, whose warmth and efficiency reminded me immediately of my grandmother Rose. That first evening, as I unpacked my belongings and set up the makeshift office that would serve as my operational headquarters, I called Emma to report my safe arrival. "How does it feel?" she asked, and I could hear the excitement in her voice, even across the continent. "Overwhelming, and perfect at the same time," I admitted. "There's so much work ahead, but everyone I've met is so committed to making this succeed. It feels like the opposite of trying to convince people I'm worth investing in. Here they already believe in the project, and they're just waiting for me to prove I can deliver." The next morning brought my first site visit to Kamana, a rural community about 2 hours south of Nairobi, where we'd be piloting the initial solar installation system. The village was smaller than I'd expected, with about 60 families living in traditional mud brick homes, scattered across rolling hills that stretched toward the distant silhouette of Mount Kilimanjaro. The community meeting took place under an enormous acacia tree that served as the village's informal gathering space. As villagers assembled in a loose circle, I was struck by the mix of curiosity and skepticism in their faces. These were people who'd been promised help before, who'd learned to be cautious about outsiders, bearing solutions to problems they'd been living with for generations. Margaret, the village chairwoman, introduced me to the group in fluent Swahili before switching to English for my benefit. This is Jordan, the young woman from America, who wants to bring electricity to our homes. She says her approach is different from others who have come before, that she wants to train our people to manage the systems themselves, rather than making us dependent on outside maintenance. I spent the next hour explaining the project through Samuel's translation, but more importantly, I listened. The villagers shared their experiences with previous development initiatives that had promised transformation but delivered disappointment. They told me about solar panels that had been installed and abandoned when they broke, about training programs that had taught skills with no practical application, about well-meaning volunteers who'd left without transferring real knowledge. "What makes you different?" asked Peter, a middle-aged farmer, whose directness I immediately appreciated. "Why should we trust that this project will succeed when so many others have failed?" The question cut to the heart of everything I'd been working toward. "Because I'm not here to save you," I said, waiting for Samuel to translate before continuing. "I'm here to work with you. The technology is only as good as the people who understand and maintain it. My job isn't to install solar panels, it's to train a team of local technicians who can install, repair, and expand the system long after I'm gone." The conversation that followed was the most honest discussion about development work I'd ever participated in. The villagers challenged my assumptions, questioned my timeline, and pushed back on elements of the plan that didn't account for local realities. By the end of the meeting, we'd modified several aspects of the implementation strategy, and I had a much clearer understanding of what success would actually look like from their perspective. Over the following weeks, I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even me. My days started before dawn and ended long after sunset, filled with technical training sessions, community meetings, equipment installations, and endless problem solving as we encountered challenges that hadn't appeared in any of my Stanford case studies. The local team I was training consisted of 6 young men and women from the surrounding villages, each chosen by their communities for their technical aptitude and leadership potential. Teaching them wasn't just about explaining how solar panels worked or how to troubleshoot electrical connections, it was about building confidence in their ability to master complex systems and take ownership of the project's long-term success. Mary, a 23-year-old woman who dropped out of technical school when her family couldn't afford the fees, emerged as the most naturally gifted technician in the group. She grasped electrical concepts quickly, asked insightful questions about system optimization, and had an intuitive understanding of how to explain technical processes to community members who'd never worked with electricity before. "I never thought I could understand things like this," she told me one afternoon, as we worked together to install a battery storage system in the village school. "My teachers always said girls weren't good at technical subjects, that we should focus on more practical skills." "Those teachers were wrong," I replied, watching her expertly connect the wiring with hands that were steadier than mine. "You have better technical instincts than half the engineers I worked with in Denver. Don't let anyone convince you that your mind isn't capable of mastering whatever interests you." The transformation I witnessed
In Mary and the other trainees over those first few weeks reminded me of my own journey at Stanford. Given the right environment and genuine support, people revealed capabilities that had been there all along, waiting for permission to emerge. The confidence that came from mastering challenging skills was universal, crossing cultural and economic boundaries. By the end of the first month, we'd successfully installed solar systems in 12 homes, wired the village school and health clinic, and established a small workshop where the local technicians could perform maintenance and minor repairs. More importantly, we'd created a sustainable model that other communities could replicate using their own trained personnel. The real test came when our first major technical problem arose. One of the main battery units failed during a particularly heavy rainstorm, leaving 6 families without power just as we were preparing to expand to the next village. In previous development projects, this would have meant waiting weeks or months for outside experts to diagnose and fix the issue. Instead, Mary and her team spent 2 days systematically troubleshooting the problem, consulting the technical manuals Emma had designed, and ultimately identifying a solution that involved rewiring the connection points to bypass the failed unit temporarily while ordering replacement parts from Nairobi. They not only fixed the immediate problem but improved the overall system design in the process. This is what success looks like. I wrote in my grandmother's journal that evening, not perfect technology that never breaks but capable people who can solve problems when it does. Word of the project's progress began to spread beyond Kenya. Dr. Martinez called to report that my work was being discussed at international development conferences, with other organizations expressing interest in adapting the training-focused model for their own initiatives. Professor Kim forwarded emails from Stanford alumni working in development who wanted to learn more about the community partnership approach we'd pioneered, but the most meaningful recognition came from an unexpected source. I was reviewing installation schedules in my guesthouse office when Grace knocked on my door with a visitor. Emma stood in the doorway, travel-worn but grinning, with a camera bag slung over her shoulder and excitement radiating from every pore. "Surprise," she said, launching herself into a hug that nearly knocked me over. I couldn't stay away any longer. I had to see this incredible work firsthand and document it properly. Over dinner that night, Emma explained that she'd used the consulting fees from her nonprofit design work to fund the trip to Kenya, with plans to create a comprehensive visual documentation of the project for future funding applications and expansion efforts. But more than that, she wanted to witness the transformation she'd heard in my voice during our weekly calls. "You sound different when you talk about this work," she said as we sat on the guesthouse patio under a canopy of stars more brilliant than anything visible in Denver. "Not just happy, but complete. Like you're finally doing exactly what you were put on Earth to do." The next morning, I took Emma to Kamana to see the project in action. Watching her interact with the community members, ask thoughtful questions about their experiences, and document the technical training sessions with her photographer's eye, I felt a profound sense of completion. For the first time in my life, my family relationships and my professional purpose were aligned rather than in conflict. Emma's visit coincided with a major milestone in the project. We were preparing to conduct our first inter-village knowledge transfer, where the Kamana technicians would travel to a neighboring community to train their counterparts in solar installation and maintenance. This peer-to-peer teaching model was designed to accelerate expansion while ensuring that communities maintained control over their own energy systems. The training session took place in Ulkaramation, a slightly larger village where the local chief had been observing our Kamana work with growing interest. Watching Mary lead a technical workshop for 20 eager students, explaining complex electrical concepts with confidence and clarity, I felt a pride that went far beyond professional satisfaction. This was capacity building in its truest form, knowledge and skills transferring from community to community without external dependency. "Mary has become a master teacher," Emma observed, capturing photos of the workshop participants bent over circuit diagrams and battery configurations. "She's not just sharing information, she's inspiring them to believe they can master this technology themselves." The success of the knowledge transfer workshop attracted attention from officials at the Kenyan Ministry of Energy who visited Kamana 2 weeks later to evaluate the project for potential scaling to other districts. The delegation included engineers, policy specialists, and development coordinators who spent 3 days interviewing community members, reviewing technical documentation, and observing the local maintenance protocols we'd established. Dr. Wanjiku, the ministry's director of rural electrification, was particularly impressed by the community ownership model we'd developed. "Most foreign-funded projects create dependency relationships that collapse when external support ends," she explained during our final meeting. "What you've built here is genuinely sustainable because the communities have full technical and operational control." The ministry visit resulted in an invitation that would change the entire trajectory of my fellowship and potentially my career. Dr. Wanjiku asked me to present the Kamana model to the East African Energy Summit in Dar es Salaam, where regional officials would be discussing strategies for expanding electrical access across rural Tanzania, Uganda, and Kenya. Your approach represents exactly the kind of innovation we need to achieve our electrification goals, she said. Community-driven implementation with strong technical training components could be the key to scaling sustainable energy access across the region. Preparing for the summit presentation required synthesizing months of field experience into a coherent framework that other development practitioners could adapt and implement. Emma threw herself into creating visual materials that would help communicate the project's impact, working with Mary and the other technicians to document their training processes and community engagement strategies. The presentation took place in a conference hall filled with government ministers, development agency representatives, and international donors who controlled millions of dollars in rural electrification funding. As I walked to the podium, I thought about the girl who'd been told she'd never be enough, now preparing to address policymakers who could impact energy access for millions of people across East Africa. Sustainable development isn't about bringing solutions to communities, I began, looking out at the sea of faces that represented decades of traditional development thinking. It's about working with communities to build their capacity to create their own solutions. The technology is secondary to the human systems that support it. The presentation lasted 30 minutes, followed by an hour of questions that ranged from technical implementation details to policy framework modifications that could support community-driven energy projects. The response was overwhelmingly positive, with several country delegations requesting follow-up meetings to discuss pilot programs in their own rural districts. But the most significant response came from Dr. James Mwangi, director of the African Development Bank's Energy Division, who approached me after the formal session ended. Miss Mitchell, your work represents a paradigm shift in how we think about rural electrification. The bank is launching a major initiative next year focused on community-driven energy access, and we'd like to discuss the possibility of you leading the technical design and implementation strategy. The offer was staggering in its scope and implications. Leading a continental-scale energy access program would mean impacting millions of lives while working at the highest levels of international development policy. It was exactly the kind of opportunity I'd dreamed about during my most ambitious moments at Stanford, but the reality of being offered it felt surreal. That evening, Emma and I sat on the hotel balcony overlooking the Indian Ocean, processing the day's events and their potential implications. "Are you going to accept?" she asked, though I could tell she already knew my answer. "How can I not?" I replied. "This is the chance to scale everything we've learned in Kenya across an entire continent. The impact could be transformational for millions of families. And it would make you one of the youngest program directors in the African Development Bank's history," Emma added with a grin. Not bad for someone who was supposedly never going to be enough. The irony wasn't lost on me. In less than 2 years, I'd gone from being dismissed by my own family to being offered leadership of a continental development initiative. But more importantly, I'd discovered that my worth had never been dependent on external validation. The confidence I'd gained from pursuing my authentic path had created opportunities that I could never have imagined while I was still trying to earn approval from people who couldn't see my potential. My phone buzzed with a call from my father, whose weekly check-ins had become one of the highlights of my time in Kenya. When I told him about the summit presentation and the job offer, his response was immediate and unequivocal. "Jordan, I'm so proud of you I can barely find words. Your mother and I have been following your work through your updates and Emma's photos, and we're in awe of what you've accomplished. You've not only exceeded our wildest dreams for you, you've shown us how limited our dreams were in the first place." The conversation that followed was remarkable for its role reversal. Instead of seeking his approval for my choices, I found myself encouraging him and my mother to consider their own unfulfilled ambitions, to think about what they might want to pursue in their remaining active years. "Watching you take these leaps has made us realize how much we've settled for comfortable rather than meaningful," he admitted. Your mother has started talking about going back to school to finish her education degree. And I've been thinking about that nonprofit work I always said I'd do someday when I retired. The ripple effects of my transformation continued to expand in ways I'd never anticipated. Emma had decided to apply to graduate programs in sustainable design, inspired by her work documenting the Kenya project and her collaboration with Dr. Martinez's organization. Tyler had reached out to inquire about volunteer opportunities with international development organizations, recognizing that his business skills could be valuable in nonprofit contexts. Even my relationship with my parents had evolved into something I'd never thought possible. Instead of the child seeking approval from authority figures, I'd become a peer whose experiences and insights they genuinely valued. Our conversations now focused on ideas, aspirations, and mutual support rather than judgment and disappointment. The final weeks of my fellowship in Kenya were bittersweet. I was excited about the African Development Bank opportunity and the potential for continental impact, but leaving the Kamana community felt like abandoning family. The relationships I'd built with Mary and the other technicians, with Margaret and the village elders, with families whose children now studied by electric light for the first time, had become central to my sense of purpose and identity. The farewell ceremony took place under the same acacia tree where I'd first met the community 6 months earlier. The village had organized a celebration featuring traditional music, dancing, and speeches that celebrated not just the solar project's success, but the partnerships we'd built together. Jordan came to us as a student, wanting to learn from our experience, Margaret said in her farewell address. She leaves as a sister, having taught us that we are capable of much more than we believed possible. The lights she brought to our homes are nothing compared to the confidence she helped us find in ourselves. Mary, now officially certified as a master technician and preparing to lead expansion efforts in 3 additional districts, presented me with a hand-carved wooden sculpture depicting a woman holding the sun. This is to remind you that you didn't just bring us solar power, she said. You showed us how to capture our own light. As my plane lifted off from Jomo Kenyatta International Airport 3 days later, I pressed my face to the window for one last glimpse of the landscape that had transformed my understanding of what was possible when people were given the tools and support to solve their own problems. The Kenya experience had taught me that sustainable change happened not when experts imposed solutions, but when communities discovered their own capacity for innovation and growth. The African Development Bank position would begin in 6 months, giving me time to complete my Stanford MBA and prepare for the next phase of my career. But as I settled into my seat for the long flight back to California, I realized that the most important transformation had already occurred. I'd evolved from someone who sought external validation to someone who created value by recognizing and developing potential in others. The girl who'd been told she'd never be enough had become a woman who understood that everyone was enough, they just needed the right environment to discover and express their capabilities. My family's inability to see my worth had taught me to look more carefully for worth in others, to create the conditions where hidden potential could emerge and flourish. Landing at San Francisco International Airport felt like returning to a launching pad rather than a destination. Stanford had given me the foundation, Kenya had provided the practical experience, and now the African Development Bank would offer the platform to scale everything I'd learned across an entire continent. Emma met me at baggage claim with a smile that could have lit up the entire terminal. "Welcome back, Continental Program Director," she said, pulling me into a hug. "Ready to change the world on an even bigger scale?" As we drove south toward Palo Alto, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. Every dismissal, every doubt, every moment of being told I wasn't enough, had been preparing me for work that required absolute confidence in human potential. My family's limitations had become the foundation for my commitment to seeing and developing capabilities that others might overlook. The work ahead would be challenging, the scale daunting, the potential for impact extraordinary. But I was no longer the person who needed guarantees before taking risks or permission before pursuing dreams. I was Jordan Mitchell, social entrepreneur, Continental Program Director, and living proof that becoming more than your family can imagine sometimes requires the courage to become exactly who you were always meant to be.
And in a beautiful twist of irony, my family now looked at my life and saw possibilities for their own transformation. The daughter they'd once tried to keep small had given them permission to dream big. The girl they'd said would never be enough had shown them what more than enough actually looked like. 3 years later, I stood in the marble-floored lobby of the African Development Bank headquarters in Abidjan, Côte d'Ivoire, waiting for the elevator that would take me to the executive briefing room where I'd be presenting the quarterly results of the Continental Energy Access Initiative to the bank's board of directors. The elevator doors reflected back a woman I barely recognized from my Denver days, someone who carried herself with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing your work matters on a scale you once could never have imagined. The numbers I was about to present were staggering even to me. In 36 months, our community-driven solar program had brought reliable electricity to over 2 million people across 15 African countries. We'd trained more than 8,000 local technicians, established 300 community-owned maintenance workshops, and created sustainable energy systems that would continue functioning long after any international funding disappeared. But the statistics, impressive as they were, told only part of the story. The real transformation was happening in places like Kamana, where Mary had become the regional coordinator for Kenya's entire rural electrification program, and in villages across Tanzania, where teenage girls were now studying engineering because they'd seen women like themselves mastering complex technical systems. As I walked into the boardroom where ministers, development officials, and international donors were assembling, I thought about how surreal it was to be leading discussions that would determine energy policy for an entire continent. The scared girl who'd once sat silently while her family dismissed her dreams couldn't have conceived of this moment. Jordan called Dr. Mongi, gesturing me toward the head of the conference table. We're eager to hear about the expansion results and your recommendations for the next phase of implementation. The presentation I delivered over the next hour detailed not just our successes but the deeper lessons we'd learned about sustainable development. The most important discovery was that communities consistently exceeded our expectations when given genuine ownership of their energy systems. Villages that had never had electricity were now generating surplus power to sell back to national grids, creating revenue streams that funded local schools and health clinics. The traditional model of development aid creates dependency, I explained to the assembled officials. Our approach creates capability. When you train local people to master technology rather than just use it, you unleash innovation that no outside expert could have predicted. During the question period that followed, Ghana's Minister of Energy asked about the program's scalability to urban areas, while Uganda's development coordinator wanted to know how the model could be adapted for water access projects. Each question reflected a growing recognition that community-driven development wasn't just more sustainable than top-down approaches, it was more effective. The most significant moment came when Dr. Sarah Okonkwo, the bank's deputy president, announced that our initiative would be receiving an additional $50 million in funding to expand across West and Central Africa. Ms. Mitchell's work has demonstrated that investing in human capacity generates greater returns than investing in infrastructure alone, she said. This program will serve as the model for all of our future rural development initiatives. Walking out of that boardroom, I felt the weight of opportunity and responsibility in equal measure. The additional funding meant we could reach another 5 million people over the next 3 years, but it also meant managing a program of unprecedented complexity across some of the most challenging environments in the world. That evening, I called Emma from my hotel room overlooking the Abidjan Lagoon. She was in her final semester of graduate school at the Rhode Island School of Design, where she was completing a master's degree in sustainable design while working on her thesis project about visual communication and development programs. "How did the board presentation go?" she asked, and I could hear the excitement in her voice even across the poor international connection. "Better than I could have hoped," I replied. "They approved the full expansion proposal and added additional funding I hadn't even requested. In 3 years we'll have brought power to more people than some countries have in their entire populations." "Jordan, that's incredible. I keep having to remind myself that the sister who used to help me with homework is now shaping energy policy for an entire continent." Emma's own transformation had been remarkable to witness. The anxious young woman who'd once hidden her ambitions to avoid family conflict had evolved into a confident professional whose thesis work on culturally sensitive development communications was already being cited by international organizations. She'd found her own path to meaningful impact, just as I'd found mine. Actually, I have news too, Emma continued. I got the call today. UNESCO accepted my proposal for their Visual Communications Fellowship. I'll be spending next year documenting education initiatives across Southeast Asia, creating materials that help communities tell their own development stories. The pride I felt at Emma's achievement rivaled anything I'd experienced regarding my own work. Watching her discover and claim her capabilities had been one of the most rewarding aspects of my own journey. We'd both learned that family support could be rebuilt on foundations of mutual respect and shared purpose. Emma, that's amazing. You're going to do incredible work with that fellowship. I learned from the best, she replied. Watching you build this career from nothing showed me what was possible when you stop asking permission to pursue your dreams. After we hung up, I stood on the hotel balcony looking out at the lights of Abidjan stretching toward the horizon. Many of those lights were powered by infrastructure projects our initiative had helped design and implement, communities that had moved from darkness to sustainable energy access in less than 2 years. My phone buzzed with a text from Tyler, something that would have been unimaginable during the dark period after I'd left Denver. Saw the Reuters article about the bank's expansion announcement. Incredible work, sis. Mom and Dad are framing it to hang in the living room next to Emma's design awards. The relationship repair with my family hadn't happened overnight, but it had been steady and genuine. My parents' initial apologies had evolved into consistent support and genuine interest in my work. They'd even visited me in Kenya during my fellowship year, spending 2 weeks volunteering with the solar installation teams and gaining first-hand understanding of the communities we served. Tyler's own evolution had been perhaps the most surprising. Inspired by my work and Emma's artistic pursuits, he'd left his corporate insurance job to become a nonprofit financial advisor, helping small international development organizations optimize their resource allocation and funding strategies. He'd found a way to use his business skills for social impact, creating his own version of meaningful work. The next morning brought a surprise visitor to my Abidjan office. Dr. Kim from Stanford had flown in for a conference on sustainable development education and had asked to meet about a proposal he'd been developing. Jordan, he said, settling into the chair across from my desk, I've been following your work since you left Stanford and I'm consistently amazed by the innovation you've brought to international development. But I have a question for you. Have you ever considered teaching? The suggestion caught me completely off guard. Teaching? I'm not sure I follow. Stanford is launching a new graduate program next year focused on community-driven development practice. We need someone to design and lead the curriculum, someone who's actually implemented sustainable development at scale rather than just studied it theoretically. Your name is at the top of our list. The idea of returning to academic life, of training the next generation of development practitioners appealed to me in ways I hadn't expected. After years of direct implementation, the opportunity to scale impact through education felt like a natural evolution. The position would allow you to continue your fieldwork during summers and breaks, Dr. Kim continued. But during the academic year, you'd be teaching graduate students and doctoral candidates, helping them understand what community-driven development looks like in practice. I'm honored by the offer, I said, my mind already racing with possibilities. But I have commitments here for at least another 2 years while we complete the current expansion phase. We anticipated that the position wouldn't begin until you're ready to transition. Stanford is willing to wait for the right person and you're absolutely the right person. The conversation continued for another hour as Dr. Kim outlined the program's vision and my potential role in shaping it. By the time he left my office, I was seriously considering a future that would combine direct development work with academic leadership, field implementation with theoretical innovation. That weekend I flew to Lagos to visit one of our newest program sites, a collection of rural communities in Ogun State where we'd recently completed our first major urban-adjacent installation. The project was particularly significant because it demonstrated how our community-driven model could be adapted for areas with more complex infrastructure and higher population densities. The village of Ajabo had been without reliable electricity for decades despite its proximity to Lagos's power grid. Previous attempts to connect the community to centralized power had failed due to political complications and infrastructure costs. Our approach had been to create an independent microgrid system that could eventually integrate with the national network but
didn't depend on it for basic functionality. Walking through Ajibo that Saturday morning, I was struck by the visible transformation that had occurred in just 8 months since implementation. The small businesses that had previously closed at sunset were now operating extended hours. The health clinic, that had relied on kerosene lamps for emergency procedures, now had reliable lighting and refrigeration for vaccines. Most importantly, the local technical team was already training technicians from 3 neighboring communities, spreading the model organically. Adunni, the lead technician for the Ajibo project, showed me through the community workshop where they manufactured some of their own replacement parts and performed advanced system modifications. We've improved the battery efficiency by 15% over the original design, she explained proudly. My team identified bottlenecks in the charging cycles and developed workarounds that extend operational life. Listening to Adunni describe technical innovations her team had developed independently reinforced my conviction that sustainable development happened when communities gained genuine ownership of their solutions. She wasn't just maintaining systems I'd designed, she was improving them based on local insights and practical experience. Have you considered pursuing formal engineering education? I asked as we completed the workshop tour. I've been accepted to the University of Lagos for their electrical engineering program, she replied. Part-time studies, so I can continue coordinating our regional expansion efforts. The community is supporting my education because they know the knowledge will benefit everyone. Stories like Adunni's were multiplying across every country where we worked. Young people who'd never imagined themselves as engineers or technicians were discovering capabilities that had been there all along, waiting for the right opportunities and support systems. The ripple effects of confidence and capability were creating transformations that went far beyond energy access. Flying back to Abidjan that Sunday evening, I found myself drafting an email to Dr. Kim expressing serious interest in the Stanford position. The academic opportunity would allow me to train hundreds of development practitioners who could then replicate and improve upon the community-driven approaches we'd pioneered. It was a chance to scale impact through human capacity rather than just program expansion. Monday morning brought news that would accelerate my decision-making timeline. Dr. Mwangi called to inform me that the United Nations had approached the African Development Bank about adapting our energy access model for their new Sustainable Development Goals implementation strategy. Jordan, they want you to lead a global task force on community-driven infrastructure development, he explained. It would mean working with development agencies worldwide to redesign how we approach basic service delivery in underserved communities. The UN opportunity was staggering in its potential scope and impact. Leading global policy development around community-driven solutions could influence how billions of dollars in development funding was allocated and implemented. But it would also mean years of high-level meetings and policy negotiations, moving further away from the direct community work that had always been the source of my deepest satisfaction. That evening, I called my parents to discuss the career choices I was facing. The conversation itself was remarkable evidence of how much our relationship had evolved. Instead of seeking their approval for decisions I'd already made, I was genuinely interested in their perspectives on complex professional challenges. Both opportunities sound incredible, my mother said after I described the Stanford and UN possibility. But which one excites you more when you imagine yourself doing the work? Her question cut straight to the heart of my dilemma. The UN position offered prestige and global influence, but the Stanford opportunity would allow me to combine teaching, research, and continued field implementation in ways that felt more aligned with my core interests and values. I think you already know your answer, my father added. You've always been happiest when you're developing people's capabilities, not just managing programs or writing policies. Teaching would let you do that on a much larger scale. Their insights helped clarify thinking that had been churning in my mind for days. The next morning, I called Dr. Kim to accept Stanford's offer, with the understanding that I'd join the faculty once I'd completed my current commitments to the African Development Bank. The decision to return to Stanford felt like coming full circle, but at a completely different level of confidence and capability. I wouldn't be arriving as a student seeking validation, but as an accomplished professional bringing real-world experience to academic discourse. The girl who'd once been told she'd never be enough was now being asked to shape how the next generation of development practitioners would think about their work. Planning my transition from field implementation to academic leadership required careful coordination with the African Development Bank and the communities we served. Over the following months, I worked with regional coordinators like Mary and Adunni to ensure that program expansion could continue seamlessly without my direct oversight. The most important element of the transition was documenting the lessons we'd learned about sustainable development practice. Emma, now completing her UNESCO fellowship in Vietnam, agreed to collaborate on a comprehensive guide that would capture both the technical and cultural aspects of community-driven implementation. The book we co-authored, Power to the People, A Practitioner's Guide to Community-Driven Development, would become required reading in development programs at universities worldwide. My final weeks in Abidjan were bittersweet but deeply satisfying. The Continental Energy Access Initiative had exceeded every metric we'd established for success, but more importantly, it had demonstrated that development programs could be both sustainable and scalable when they prioritized human capacity over technological solutions. The farewell celebration at the African Development Bank brought together colleagues from across the continent, community leaders from villages where we'd worked, and government officials who'd helped implement policy changes that supported community-driven approaches. Dr. Mwangi's remarks during the ceremony captured something I'd been feeling but hadn't been able to articulate. "Jordan came to us with impressive credentials and ambitious plans," he said. "But what made her exceptional wasn't her educational background or technical expertise. It was her fundamental belief that every community contains the intelligence and creativity needed to solve its own problems. She didn't bring solutions to Africa, she helped African communities discover and implement their own solutions." Standing in that reception hall surrounded by people whose lives had been touched by our work, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this moment. The family dinner where I'd been told I'd never be enough felt like it had happened to a different person, someone I'd once been but had grown far beyond. 3 days later, boarded a flight from Abidjan to San Francisco, carrying with me not just personal belongings but also memories, relationships, and insights that would shape the rest of my career. The Africa work had taught me that sustainable change happened through human development, not infrastructure projects, and that lesson would become the foundation for everything I'd teach at Stanford. Emma met me at SFO with the same enthusiasm she'd shown during my return from Kenya years earlier, but now she carried herself with the confidence of someone who'd found her own path to meaningful work. Her UNESCO fellowship had resulted in permanent position with the organization, developing visual communication strategies for education initiatives across the developing world. "Welcome back to California," she said, as we drove south toward Palo Alto. "Ready to become Professor Mitchell?" The title felt strange but exciting. In just a few months, I'd be standing in front of Stanford classrooms full of ambitious graduate students who reminded me of my younger self, eager to change the world, but not yet understanding how complex and rewarding that work would be. I keep thinking about that dinner 3 years ago when Dad told us we'd never be enough, Emma said as we crossed the San Mateo Bridge. If someone had told me then that we'd both end up building international careers around social impact, I'd have thought they were crazy. The girl who was told she'd never be enough became someone who spent her career helping others discover they're more than enough, I replied, and the best part is, this is just the beginning. Now I get to teach other people to see potential that others might miss. As we pulled onto the Stanford campus where my new faculty position awaited, I realized that coming full circle didn't mean returning to where you started, it meant bringing everything you'd learned on the journey back to a place where it could create new possibilities for others. The girl who'd been dismissed by her own family had become a woman whose work had touched millions of lives across multiple continents. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned that becoming more than your family can imagine isn't about proving them wrong. It's about growing into the person you were always capable of becoming, whether they could see it or not. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, that growth creates space for them to discover new possibilities for themselves as well. My family's limitations had become the foundation for my commitment to seeing and developing unlimited potential in others. The woman who'd once been told she wasn't enough had dedicated her life to helping communities, students, and colleagues discover they were more than enough. They just needed the right environment and support to reveal capabilities that had been there all along. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.